Most people think of a heist in terms of steel, cold vault doors, laser grids, the sharp click of a combination lock. But the most mathematically precise industrial theft in North American history didn't involve a single ounce of metal. It involved a liquid, thick, amber, heavy. In the province of Quebec, this liquid is treated with the same regulatory intensity as crude oil or strategic uranium. It's called maple syrup, but in the underground economy, it's simply known as liquid gold. In the late summer of 2011, a routine audit inspector walked into a high-security storage facility in Saint Louis de Blandford. The inspector wasn't looking for a crime, just an inventory number. Climbing a steel ladder to the second tier of stacked blue drums, a hand reached out to brace against a barrel that should have weighed exactly 600 pounds. It moved, not slightly. It shifted with a light, almost buoyant resistance. A knuckle tapped the steel. Expecting the dull, solid thud of dense sugar, the sound that came back was a hollow, metallic ring that echoed through the empty warehouse. The seal was pried back. It wasn't syrup, it was water. The next barrel, water. The next, empty. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line that evening, the Quebec maple syrup producers realized they weren't dealing with a missing shipment. They were looking at a void. Nearly 10,000 barrels had been siphoned clean. 3,000 tons, $18.7 million, gone. And not a single alarm had ever triggered. How do you drain a national reserve without moving a single truck out of place? How do you bypass a system built to track every drop? Tonight, we deconstruct the physics, the logistics, and the quiet machinery behind the Great Maple Syrup Heist. To understand how this happened, you have to look past the syrup and look at the system that holds it. Quebec doesn't just make maple syrup, it controls it. The province produces roughly 72% of the global supply. That level of dominance creates a unique economic reality. If you flood the market, prices collapse. If you restrict it, prices soar. So the provincial government built the FPAQ, the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers. It operates less like a farmers' cooperative and more like a state-managed cartel. It sets production quotas, it dictates export pricing, and it maintains the global strategic reserve. Every year, producers hand over their surplus to the Federation. The syrup is pumped into standardized 5-gallon barrels. Those barrels are stacked in climate-controlled warehouses across rural Quebec. They sit there, waiting. The Federation sells them slowly, strategically, to keep global prices stable. For the producers, it's frustrating. They grow the syrup, but they don't control the timeline. For the buyers outside the system, it's expensive. The quota creates artificial scarcity, and scarcity always breeds a shadow market. Meet Richard Valliere. He wasn't a career criminal. He wasn't a smuggler in the traditional sense. He was a logistics operator, a middleman who understood truck routes, warehouse leases, and the blind spots of bureaucratic inventory management. He saw the strategic reserve not as a vault, but as a pressure valve waiting to be opened. The warehouse in Saint Louis de Blandford was chosen deliberately. It wasn't a military fortress. It was a rented industrial space, secure enough to deter casual theft, open enough to allow heavy machinery in and out without raising suspicion. Valliere didn't need to crack a code. He didn't need to cut a wire. He just needed a key, a set of industrial pumps, and a fundamental understanding of density. The system's greatest strength was its scale. 10,000 barrels stacked floor to ceiling. To audit it properly would require emptying and weighing every single drum. But the Federation didn't do that. They did visual checks. They checked seals. They checked inventory logs. They assumed the barrels were heavy because they were supposed to be. That assumption was the first crack in the foundation. Stealing syrup isn't like stealing cash. You can't fold it into a briefcase. You can't hide it in a wall. 3,000 tons is roughly the weight of 400 African elephants. Moving it requires engineering. It requires a rhythm. Valliere and his crew didn't raid the warehouse. They occupied it, quietly. Over the course of nearly a year, they transformed a legitimate storage facility into what investigators would later call a ghost factory. The operation ran on a simple, brutal loop. Under the cover of night, unmarked tanker trucks would back into the loading dock. The crew would open a barrel. They wouldn't take it. They would insert a heavy-duty industrial pump and begin siphoning. The amber liquid moved through clear hoses into hidden transport tanks. But they couldn't leave the Federation's barrel empty. An empty barrel changes the stack's center of gravity. It changes the visual profile. It raises an immediate red flag. So they replaced it. But not with syrup, with water. This is where the heist moves from theft to applied physics. Maple syrup has a specific gravity of roughly 1.37. Water sits at 1.0. That means water is nearly 30% lighter. If you fill a syrup barrel to the exact same volume with water, anyone who lifts it will feel the difference instantly. The slosh will be different. The weight distribution will be wrong. The crew had to compensate. They couldn't just pour water in and seal it. They had to adjust the volume. They left a calculated air gap at the top of each barrel, just enough space to account for the missing density. They replaced the metal seals. They wiped the rims. They restacked the drums with mechanical precision. Then they drove away. The syrup traveled to a secondary location, a private sugar shack deep in the woods. There, it was filtered, rebottled, and given new paperwork. It entered the market as independent surplus, as surplus stock from unregulated producers. The ghost factory ran night after night, barrel after barrel. The warehouse looked identical from the outside. The inventory logs matched. The seals were intact. But inside, the National Reserve was slowly being hollowed out. It was a crime of patience. It required hundreds of silent trips, thousands of precise calculations. And it worked because the Federation was looking at paper, while the crew was looking at physics. You can steal 3,000 tons of liquid, but eventually you have to sell it. And selling it requires navigating a global market that tracks every ounce. Valliere didn't move the syrup to street corners. He moved it to distributors. He built a network of buyers in New Brunswick, Ontario, and the northeastern United States. These were legitimate syrup processors. They didn't ask questions about origin. They only cared about volume and price. And Valliere offered them a rate the Federation would never match. To make the movement invisible, he weaponized bureaucracy. He generated fake invoices. He created shell distribution companies. He routed shipments through legitimate freight channels. On paper, the syrup looked like legal surplus. It looked like independent production that had bypassed the quota. It looked clean. The system's blindness was its own doing. The Federation operated on trust and scale. They assumed that if syrup entered the market, it had passed through the proper channels. They didn't have a mechanism to track viscosity or taste profile across state lines. They tracked numbers, and the numbers, manipulated by Valliere's network, looked normal. But markets are sensitive. They react to pressure, even invisible pressure. Throughout late 2011 and early 2012, buyers in the US began noticing an anomaly. There was suddenly more syrup available. Prices dipped slightly. Independent processors were receiving bulk shipments at rates that undercut the Federation's fixed pricing. The volume didn't match the reported harvest. The math was off. The Federation noticed the dip. They ran internal audits. They checked their reserve logs. Everything matched. But the market was telling a different story. Someone was leaking. The system was being siphoned from the outside, but the source was clearly internal. The ghost factory had been running in the dark for months, and now the sun was up. The downfall of the Great Syrup Heist wasn't a whistleblower. It wasn't a high-speed chase. It was chemistry. Maple syrup is chemically stable. Its high sugar concentration acts as a natural preservative. It doesn't ferment. It doesn't breed bacteria. It just sits. But water does not share those properties. The water the crew used to refill the barrels was municipal tap water. It contained minerals. It contained organic material. It was not sterile. As the Quebec summer of 2012 pushed temperatures past 30 degrees Celsius, the water inside the stolen barrels began to react. It fermented. It grew algae. It began to corrode the interior steel of the drums from the inside out. The seals, originally tight, began to weaken under the pressure of gas buildup. The warehouse, once smelling faintly of caramel and wood, now carried a sharp, metallic odor. Rust, stagnation, decay. But the chemical breakdown wasn't what brought them in. It was the paper trail. Once the audit confirmed the physical theft, the Sûreté du Quebec launched Operation Vision. They didn't just look for missing barrels, they looked for the syrup itself. Every maple grove in Quebec has a mineral signature. The soil composition, the rainfall patterns, the specific species of tree. It leaves a microscopic fingerprint in the syrup. Forensic analysts began testing discounted syrup, flooding the US and Atlantic Canadian markets. They ran mass spectrometry on the samples. The mineral ratios matched. The isotopic signature matched. The syrup being sold at a discount wasn't from independent producers. It was from the strategic reserve. The trail led to the freight records. The freight records led to the shell companies. The shell companies led to the loading docks. And the loading docks led to Richard Valliere. The operation was dismantled methodically. 26 individuals were arrested. The network of drivers, warehouse operators, and distributors collapsed under the weight of the evidence. Valliere was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay a $10 million restitution. But the syrup? Most of it was already gone. It had been bottled, shipped, sold. It was sitting on diner tables across New England. It was in grocery store pantries. The evidence had been consumed. The only thing left behind was the empty warehouse, the rusted barrels, and a system that had been outmaneuvered by patience and physics. Today, the strategic reserve doesn't operate on trust. It operates on paranoia. The warehouses have been rebuilt into digital fortresses. Every barrel sits on a computerized load cell. If a single drum loses half an ounce of mass, an alarm triggers in a monitoring center. The floors are equipped with pressure-sensitive motion grids. The loading docks run on biometric access logs. The syrup is treated like nuclear material, because in the eyes of the Federation, it is. The Great Maple Syrup Heist remains a quiet legend in the world of macro crime. It wasn't about greed, it was about system exploitation. It proved that when you centralize a resource, you create a single point of failure. It proved that logistics can be weaponized. And it proved that the most effective thefts don't happen in the dark. They happen in plain sight, masked by the assumption that the system is working exactly as it should. Valliere didn't break into a vault. He understood the vault's rhythm. He matched its weight. He moved at the speed of its bureaucracy. And by the time anyone noticed the barrel was hollow, the liquid gold was already gone. I'm the narrator for Bedtime Heists. Next time you look at an industrial resource, ask yourself what's holding it in place, and what happens when someone decides to match its weight. In our next episode, we move from the warehouse to the riverbank, the bridge that got stolen for scrap, how an entire steel landmark was dismantled in broad daylight, and why the law never saw it coming. Subscribe to stay in the shadows. Sleep well.